I'm going to switch over from our Collaborate session to this essay that I just opened from the library about Freedom's Journal, which is considered the first African American newspaper. And as this article says, it was published on the 16th of March, 1827 in New York City. And a generation before the New York Times started to be published. It had the journalistic goal of providing an objective source of information to promote the common good. And interestingly, they say our column shall ever be open to a temperate discussion of interesting subjects. But in respect to matters of religion, we would not be the advocates of any particular sect or party. In the discussion of political subjects, we shall ever regard the Constitution of the United States as our polar star, pledged to no party. It should never be our object to court controversy, though we must at all times consider ourselves as champions in defense of oppressed humanity. So this claim is in part to probably avoid censorship, and African Americans in New York City in 1827 had a pretty vibrant free black community. There was a free African school, and there were black churches, a black neighborhood and community. Eventually, that neighborhood, which I believe was in the lower part of Manhattan, eventually it was destroyed, and they built high rises and things like that. But in the 1820s and possibly in the 30s and 50s, white supremacists attacked the free black community in New York City. So when the Capitol riots happened earlier this year, I guess, I made a video about the history of attacks and riots against black communities and the parallels between the Capitol riot and those other attacks. So this newspaper puts forward a very conservative veneer and is very careful to avoid censorship and to avoid any backlash, because we're talking about the 1820s and we're talking about Andrew Jackson's America. So when Andrew Jackson was elected president, you might remember Jackson's from Kentucky, and he champions white laborers, and the extension of suffrage to all white men is a feature of the 1820s. So the emboldening of the white working class resulted in danger to the black middle class in New York City, because this black middle class, including Samuel Cornish, who was one of the editors of Freedom Journal, had built schools, had built a thriving middle class community. There were artisans, blacksmiths, pharmacists, doctors, you name it. So the white working class in New York City would blame their lack of economic access and opportunity on the fact that, this black community had taken up space. Because part of the propaganda used to get white supremacy activated and causing trouble is that this space of the United States is a white space, and anyone infringing on that white space that white supremacists feel entitled to results in white supremacist violence. So they're very conservative and very careful in Freedom's Journal. As it says, 30 years before the end of slavery, history names some of the 12 men, but not the women, who founded Freedom's Journal, who played important roles in its development. David Walker of Boston, who you might have heard of, because David Walker also was responsible for sending a bunch of pamphlets to Charleston, South Carolina, that were to be disseminated among enslaved people so they would learn about the abolition movement. And David Walker was a a very powerful speaker. And he was a free black man who wasn't afraid to go to the South and speak on abolition. And he was poisoned. So he had a short life. Also, Nathaniel Paul of Albany, Richard Allen of Philadelphia. Have you heard of Richard Allen, or the African Methodist Episcopal Church? So Richard Allen is one of the leaders of the early African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the AME Church also started its own newspapers shortly after this. And Samuel Cornish, the Jamaican-born John Russwurm, is co-editors. They had agents in England, Haiti, Washington, D.C., Virginia, North Carolina, and other states. Nothing less serious than advancing the moral, religious, civil, and literary improvement of our race. And they also were very aware of their white audience. So one of the great comments in the first article of the first issue is, "We wish to plead our own cause because we're always misrepresented." And I think that's a great comment, but here we are 200 years later, right? And the same thing still is a wish. So one of the common topics, interestingly, in Freedom's Journal is the Nation of Haiti. And again, 200 years later, we think about Haiti just having had another catastrophic earthquake, and the storms hitting Haiti right now, and so many people suffering. And Freedom's Journal had a completely different perspective on Haiti because Haiti was the first truly free nation in the Western Hemisphere. Do you know anything about the Haitian Revolution? So after Haiti declared its independence and created a constitution so that it would be a republic in 1805, Haitian leaders started encouraging emigration from the United States, and people like the founders of Freedom's Journal and that free black community in New York City often considered going to Haiti and contributing their expertise and knowledge to a free black nation rather than the United States. The beginning of the question of should we stay has a lot to do with people choosing to emigrate to Haiti and to obtain land in Haiti. Also, everyone who fought in the Haitian Revolution received an allocation of land. So even though Haiti is an incredibly poor country, almost everyone has ancestral lands. Some of them might have been diminished because of the shifting borders and the conflicts with the Dominican Republic, but essentially the light that Haiti shines on the world in 1827 is something that Freedom's Journal repeatedly emphasizes, because yes, the story of the United States becoming an independent nation is a great story, but in the process of that story, women didn't obtain rights, and of course slavery continued. So Freedom's Journal very subtly points out that the difference in Haiti is universal emancipation. Therefore, the Haitian Revolution accomplished more than any other revolution in that era of revolution. Do you know, sorry Barak, you're the only one here, so I'm going to have to point the questions at you, but Rose, feel free to jump in as well. Just turn off your microphone and give us a shout if you want to add. Do you know what Thomas Jefferson's initial reaction was to the Haitian Revolution? If you don't, take a wild guess.
I would assume it wasn't happiness. I would assume it was we need to take better precautions to make sure something like that doesn't happen over here, because the Haitian Revolution was very bloody and very violent.
Mm-hmm.
They left almost no slaveholders alive.
Right. That's true, and I'll reiterate what Barak said. Jefferson was very frightened by the Haitian Revolution. And in Notes on Virginia, he writes about the fact that we're going to have a race war. And I think that precedes the Haitian Revolution. So it was kind of something that he had feared and anticipated in terms of a race war. Then, although he wasn't necessarily negative about it, because he believed in revolutions and he believed in freedom, and he did believe that slavery would end on itself, that it didn't require him, although he kind of wanted to abolish it, he couldn't because he was always in so much debt. Jefferson was slightly inspired by the Haitian Revolution, just as another revolution and as perhaps evidence that he was wrong about Africans and people of African descent. But when Jefferson was president 30 years later, he invoked a complete embargo of Haiti. So there was what was called the cordon sanitaire in French. There was English and French and US ships kind of made a circle around Haiti and protected the waters around it to prevent Haiti from trading with any other nation. So this made it such that the only option for Haitian nation building was a completely agrarian subsistence lifestyle. They weren't able to sell sugar, which had made France the richest nation in the world. They weren't able to sell coffee. It pretty much became a nation of subsistence farming that then didn't have any way to defend itself from the rest of the world. And at the same time, England, France, and the United States refused to recognize Haiti as a free and independent nation, and occasionally attacked and pirates and all kinds of trouble. Finally, in the 30s, France said, we will recognize you as a nation, and told Haiti that they could have nation status if they would pay an indemnity from the war, which meant they had to pay France for themselves, essentially, for all of the losses that France endured in the war. Fortunately, they didn't have to pay, Haiti didn't have to pay for the Louisiana Purchase, because the reason that France was willing to sell most of what is now the United States to Thomas Jefferson is that they had just had their ass whooped by Haiti, and they didn't want to fight more of these battles in the New World. So fortunately, Haiti didn't have to pay for the loss, because the Louisiana Purchase was a great bargain. But Haiti, they had to pay for themselves. And the equivalent of what they had to pay to France for that indemnity would be billions of dollars today. And that continued the economic disaster that Haiti continues to face, even though it has this really glorious background in history. So in Freedom's Journal, nonetheless, before things had started to become almost impossible, they write about Haiti quite often. And when they seek to represent African cultures in the Americas, they often look toward Haiti. So that's a theme that we'll see in the discussion quite a bit. So I didn't find the copies that I took from the library database, and we might not have that database anymore. However, if we do go to assignments, and I'm updating the checklist in the assignment list a little bit. When we go to Freedom's Journal, we have some documents, and the first is a list of the readings that I have copied from various sources that are directly from Freedom's Journal. And I ask each person in the class to look at one of the articles and to talk about it a little bit. So, as you can see, several of them are about Haiti. And if we...
I read the first one. Madam Christoph. First, I haven't read the concluded one yet.
Yeah.
The first one. Really nice, right? And they were talking about Haiti because the narrator of the portion was talking about we've seen two former black women who used to work for the former king of Haiti, who she's not a widow, so I assume he.
Actually, go ahead and turn on your microphone, and I'll pause mine so that everybody can hear you on this recording that I hope I'm actually making. Oh no, I'm sorry, your microphone isn't going to work because I'm using QuickTime. Sorry. Hi, Anaya. We're talking about, I don't know when you checked in, but we're talking about Freedom's Journal here. And Barak just mentioned that he read this article about Madame Christophe. So the best known Haitian revolutionaries are Toussaint Louverture, Henri Christophe, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. So Toussaint actually got hornswoggled by France. Toussaint remained loyal to France, and then France tricked him and attacked Haiti again in 1801 and tried to make it a colony again. Dessalines and Henri Christophe, who were also generals with Toussaint, considered that the last straw. And Henri Christophe called himself Emperor of Haiti temporarily. And then he died, and Dessalines is the man who wrote the Constitution. And he's also infamous because he decided that no white people could stay in Haiti. So he had a roundup and a massacre of whites. And that sounds like a genocide, except you, in Haiti at that time, you weren't white unless you considered yourself not Haitian. So it wasn't so much a matter of the color of your skin.
It was more of who do you claim loyalty to?
Yeah.
France, and you said France, boy.
Right.
Now you're the enemy.
Yeah.
You're in enemy territory right now.
Right, because people who continued to be loyal to France or England, and some of them were biracial or even black, they were white because they were not down for the cause of creating this independent nation. So this is about a sighting, and it's kind of funny because it's almost like a gossip magazine, but it is in Italy, I believe. Yes, in Florence. There's a sighting of the ex-Empress Queen of Haiti, Marie-Thérèse, the wife, or rather widow of the late Henri Christophe, the great Emperor and King of Haiti, defender of the faith and sovereign Grand Master of the Order of Henri. Here was an extraordinary encounter, and although I knew by experience that Florence is the place of all others for meeting to see, famous people, I was shocked to see her under these extraordinary circumstances. Followed her to a narrow staircase, and without considering whether I had any business there or not, I found that it was a public place. I saw the queen, the princess, her daughter, and a sort of cafe au lait colored dame de campagne. I guess the ladies' maids seat themselves at a small table and order some macaroni. So this person sits at the next table and asks the landlord how these illustrious guests came to be there, and he says they're great people in their own country, although they're not the same color. They're going to go live somewhere else by this church, and so they're. The long story short, they're still living in exile in Italy with some dignity. I don't think it's in Freedom's Journal, but I think it's in a later African American magazine. They report the marriage of this daughter, this princess, to a European dignitary or possibly royalty. So the point here about the royalty, it's almost like a sighting of Meghan Markle in Vancouver.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, when I was reading that last night, it felt really paparazzi-ish.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always funny seeing things like that. It was like, it was always like that for
the royals.
For the famous. Well, royal back then, you probably have to be royal, but now it's just the famous in general.
Yeah.
That just wherever you were, if you were sighted, people just, they talk benefit. They already could took pictures. They would have took pictures if they could.
Yeah. Yeah, they would have. Yeah, so it continues, and then this person decides to kind of start stalking her like the paparazzi. But there's a few of the things that are happening here that are really magnificent are that we have a black correspondent in Florence reporting to the Freedom's Journal. So Freedom's Journal did have correspondents and agents in Europe. And Madame Christophe and her daughter, you know, it's like seeing Meghan Markle in Vancouver. I can't think of any major ways that it's different, except for Meghan Markle didn't have a violent extradition to Vancouver. She chose to leave, and Madame Christophe probably had to flee for her life. But this is 1827, and there's a concept of black nationalism that they don't bring about overtly or state heavy-handedly in Freedom's Journal. It's the idea that people of African descent have as distinguished a lineage and tremendous a potential as anyone else in the world. So by upholding this example of royalty, and later in the marriage article saying, you know, Haitian royalty can marry into the European system of royalty, there's something happening that is so contrary to the logic of race and racism, right?
I want to say when I don't talk about it here, and you look at how much of this portion of the university talks about Haiti, I think about that being circulated in 1828 in the United States. It shows something that, you know, now is obvious because you look at all the things they did to ensure any rebellions would be unsuccessful. But then a lot of the talk to slaves would be, you're not smart enough to be free. You don't know what a rebellion is. The United States is going through a real rebellion. You're not intelligent enough. You're not ethical enough. You're not strong enough to do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And to have it shared around the people that not only is it possible, it's been done on this side of the world.
Yeah.
This is something that is not, it may be a rarity, but in the grand scheme of time, this is around the time it would happen. Because, you know, you've been through, at this point, let's see, this is about 400 years in slavery. You would see it's been generation after generation after generation. It was bound to happen. And there have been many unsuccessful, you know, forms of rebellion. And to see a successful one, I'm not surprised that they would be like, okay, just the idea of this, the Haitian Revolution, just the idea of the Haitian Revolution is dangerous.
Yeah.
To share that idea among the enslaved and unenslaved in the United States is even more dangerous. So we gotta be careful about how we speak about it and what we say in this paper. Because at this time, you're not just talking about people taking away the publication of the paper. You're talking about people burning down where you print your paper and coming to find everybody that's ever written in it.
Yeah.
This is dangerous.
Yeah. And another great thing about it, Anaya and Rose, can you hear Barak? A little, okay. Yeah, I just turned, hopefully it's a little better. I just turned my computer around so maybe they'll be better. And I'll get a little bit closer to where we're being masked up and safe. Because, yeah. So, Anaya and Rose, what's your reaction to this 200 years ago newspaper created and written by black people to plead their own cause and represent themselves against the misrepresentations of race that claims scientifically blacks are inferior. How do you two react to this kind of information? And if you're just processing it, I understand that because it is it's pretty amazing. But go ahead, and if you want to raise your hand or if you want to jump in, you're welcome to do that. I'm going to switch over a little bit more. And the first issue copy that I have here is in the format that scholars have had to usually read it. So we looked at that article by Frances Smith Foster from Early American History, the very beginning of this discussion, in which she introduced Freedom's Journal and reminded us a little bit about the danger that the creators of Freedom Journal were in just for writing this newspaper. But the other thing that Foster would tell you about if she were here is that reading these newspapers, which were originally only available on microfilm, if you know what microfilm is, this is what we had to work with, because I've worked on the African American 19th century newspapers too, following the inspiration of Carla Peterson and Frances Smith Foster, who are absolutely wonderful people and professors, and I think Professor Foster has retired. But this is what we had to read. And actually, this is particularly good quality as far as it goes. So this beginning, I think there's something worthy in looking at the actual paper and the actual historical document. And what's really exciting is if you go to an archive, and you're going to think I'm crazy maybe, but if you go to an archive and you get to touch a document that W.B. Du Bois has touched, or that even at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, they have some of Phyllis Wheatley's books with Phyllis Wheatley's notes. So when you touch that book, you're touching something that Phyllis Wheatley has touched. So to me, that's almost as exciting as riding the wild eagle at Dollywood, and perhaps even more so for my brain. So there's something exciting about looking at the original, but also extremely exhausting. So here we have the original Freedom's Journal, Cornish and Russworm proprietors. I think the fact that Russworm is a Jamaican is worth noting as well, because some of the really important free black leaders were from the Caribbean. Prince Hall was Barbadian or Bajan, and the play Hamilton emphasizes the fact that Alexander Hamilton, as a bastard was he from Barbados too? From the Caribbean, was probably, or as likely to have been, of African descent as not. So Russworm and Cornish write, and presenting our first number to our patrons, we feel all the diffidence of persons entering to something new, so they're humbling themselves. They're not sure of their project and their object. A paper devoted to the dissemination of useful knowledge and improvement must meet with the cordial approbation of every friend to humanity. We're aware of the peculiarities of this journal, which require us to actually go ahead and write it, meaning this is the first black journal that we know of. And we have to have it this way and have it be an all-black enterprise, because this great line, we wish to plead our own cause. Too long others have spoken for us. Too long has the public been deceived by misrepresentation and things which concern us dearly. So, although many might say they have benevolent feelings toward us, there are others who enlarge on the least trifle, which tends to discredit any person of color. Like, again, let one black celebrity do something stupid, you know. Bill Cosby got so much more attention than that movie producer whose name slips my mind. Yeah, Harvey Weinstein. So much more sensational about Bill Cosby than Harvey Weinstein. And I think this, you know, that's just an example of if one of us steps out of line, the least trifle, it becomes a reflection on all black people. So Bill Cosby became a reflection of black men, and Harvey Weinstein was just a pervert who, yeah, an individual. So there's where individualism works beautifully. So this is the magnificent first issue of Freedom's Journal, which I absolutely love and adore. So what I would like you to do here with Freedom's Journal is take a look at the issue that I asked you to comment on. So let's see, Rose, you do have that initial to our patrons, and I think there's also a copy that's a bit more readable. And which one did I assign to you, Barak? Did I forget to assign one to you, Barak? Okay, so you have, yeah, the Madame Christophe in conclusion. Great. And Anaya, did you see which one I asked you to look at? Because I might have goofed it up a little bit. I apologize if I didn't put one. Let's see. Yeah. Anaya, how about, since I think I didn't do this correctly, how about if I ask you to look at removal of slaves to Haiti? And we'll open it first and take a quick look at it, because I don't think it's as long. Oh, please don't tell me it's not even there. Oh, here it is. Okay. So this says, from the Genius of Universal Emancipation, which I think might be a British publication. It was very common in 19th century newspapers just to borrow articles. It was kind of like how the AP, Associated Press, shares information today. But the things that they selected to reprint are, to me, as significant as the things that they wrote originally, you know, if they felt something was suitable to plead their own cause. And let me Google real quickly the freedom of universal emancipation, or Genius. All right, the Genius of Universal Emancipation was a Baltimore newspaper, and it was William Lloyd Garrison and Benjamin Lundy. So although Freedom's Journal is not an abolitionist newspaper, and they're very careful about their rhetorical strategy in not talking about abolition, they do borrow from this first abolitionist newspaper in the United States. And William Lloyd Garrison is one of the most famous abolitionists, unfortunately, because he had a lot of flaws in his vision for abolition, including his inability to really see people of African descent as equal. But Benjamin Lundy did have his printing press destroyed and did have to flee for his life, and might have been dragged behind a a cart for a while, as punishment. So they borrowed from the genius of universal emancipation. The editor, Garrison, is about to dispatch a vessel to Haiti with a number of emancipated slaves in the course of the present winter. It will probably sail in February. From 50 to 100 more can be taken than are now engaged. And such humane and philanthropic slaveholders are desirous to give their slaves an opportunity to obtain their freedom in a way that will be advantageous to all parties. So those slaveholders can apply to let their emancipated slaves go with William Lloyd Garrison and Benjamin Lundy to Haiti. The owners who may be thus disposed need incur no further expense than may what be necessary in delivering them at Norfolk, Virginia. They will be received at that place, furnished with the necessary provisions, and have time to raise the means to procure more provisions for themselves. When they fulfill their contracts, meaning when you're emancipated, according to this plan by Garrison, you have to work through a contract and get what you need to go to Haiti. And then you're allowed to go to Haiti on this ship at no cost to your former owner. Oh, how nice, right? You will be received, and if they, this is this is funny. When people go to Haiti, they will receive land from the government without any expense. If they choose to take it, they may renew their contracts in that or any other country, meaning you're completely free. But if you go to Haiti, you get what? Yeah.
So they're saying you're going to work yourself to your freedom here.
Mm-hmm.
And the right to go to Haiti. We'll send you to Haiti after you've worked enough money for it to be worth us to send you to Haiti.
Yes.
And then the Haitian government is
Mm-hmm.
going to give you land.
Yes.
That it's so many things.
It's what?
It's so many things wrong with that plan from beginning to end. Because first of all, that's not really freedom. That's indentured servitude.
Yeah.
Then once you get out of the indentured servitude, we're going to put you on what I assume will not be well-made ships. They're not going to use their top ships. A lot of people probably would have died just on the trip getting to Haiti.
People weren't excited to get back on ships, no.
And then once you get them to Haiti, I don't know where they got, because Haiti is not huge. Like, if you're talking about the entire African population, Haiti is not, like, Africa is large. Even if you're just talking about West Africa,
Mm-hmm.
that's still a lot of land. Even the United States is large. Haiti is relatively in size. It's similar to about a state or two over here. It's
Mm-hmm.
It's differently shaped,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not huge. So when we talking about a square foot per person, something like that, it just sounds like a lot of I don't like slavery, but I don't really care about the people enslaved. I just think it's wrong. And
Right.
It sounds like somebody that has been judged by the people around them, like
Mhm.
kind of how maybe they felt like other nations judge us
Mhm.
for this.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get rid of it. I don't really care about the slaves. I care about how we're viewed by other nations. This is what it sounds like, because that's the only way I can think you could get this sort of reasoning.
Yeah, this is what's wrong with William Lloyd Garrison. You're absolutely right. So remember, this is a reprint. Rushforth and Cornish weren't going to touch this. They were not about to say, oh, look, the white men have come up with this benevolent plan where benevolent and kind slave owners can drop you off in Norfolk, where you'll have to work until you can support yourself, pay for your provisions, and eventually get on a boat to go to Haiti, where, yes, the government did give people land, but you'll have to do a contract in Haiti because there's white folks in Haiti at this point, including this man from Florida who had an African wife and a lot of biracial kids, and he thought slavery was a really great idea, but he didn't want his own kids enslaved. So this guy wrote extensively and worked with Benjamin Lundy to create colonies in Haiti where he owned the land and people could work for him to, get these land allocations so that some blacks from the United States could go live in Haiti. And it was pretty much because this kind of crazy white slave owner who was married to an African woman and had like 12 biracial children wanted a place for his own kids, because part of the logic too was the people who are going to have the knowledge, the initiative, and the courage to do something like this are going to be pretty well-informed people, enslaved people. There are people who might know how to read and write. There are people who have a concept of how to start their,
I wouldn't trust that.
Right.
I can't imagine being a slave and like, yeah, you can have your freedom. Just admit to us that you can read and write.
Right.
That sounds...
Right. It's all very sketchy, and it's also a way to take the African Americans who are capable of starting their own businesses to get them out of the United States. And slaveholders are like, oh yeah, I've got these troublemaking slaves who know too much and run things too much, and they could totally run their own farm, and I don't want them here because they're going to kill me. They don't need me. So yeah, so to a certain extent, this reprint, it's just kind of sitting here, it's sitting there in Freedom's Journal, and they don't say a word about it. Russell and Cornish put it in here, and they reprint, and so their white readers are going to be, possibly like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But you kind of wonder what the black readers of Freedom's Journal or what the conversation in the newsroom was like when they reprinted this. Probably a lot like everything you're saying, Barak.
That's probably a lot of, be careful, because these people want to end slavery, but they might not want your freedom.
Yes.
I feel like that's an important distinction that a newspaper such as this should make.
Yeah.
Just like how they're talking about the idea that rebellion is possible through all the talking about Haiti. It's also important to know, like, hey, there's a lot of white people that will probably maybe even come near your state, depending on how deep south you go. It's kind of the further you go, it's kind of more dangerous it gets. You might even hear word of from just talking and speaking, that people talking about you no longer being a slave. But be careful, because they might not be talking about your freedom and the right to self-determination.
Well, it's also, it's white space. It's getting them out of the white space, because white supremacy sees the United States as white space. So if there are enslaved people who threaten the whiteness of the space, send them to Haiti. Push the eject button and get them out of Haiti. It's interesting, the line that says, they will be empathically free the moment they touch the soil of Haiti, under the protection of a Republican government composed of their brethren. In a land where continual summer produces the fruits of the earth in abundance and the rigors of the winter are unknown. They'll be way better off in Haiti than if they went to Canada. They'll be empathically free.
So many things. I can see this going so many different ways. I could see a situation where, say something like this is, it happens, it's enacted, and large amounts of slaves end up going and being quote unquote free in Haiti, and Haiti becomes prosperous. I can see it becoming almost like a Liberia situation where we're going to send you over there and you'll be, over there, but whoever's in charge will answer to us. Whoever's in charge will do what we say. We'll get a cut of all that sugar that's coming out of you. I can see a situation like that. So it's like, this isn't liberation.
It's
moving. It's almost reminds me of moving the issue that's here and just being like, let's just move this over here. It'll be out of our face, but we'll still get all the benefits from it.
Yeah, and this is how we're going to solve the problem of slavery from Garrison and Lundy. We're going to take the blacks who really threatened to end slavery on their own, and we're going to send them to Haiti. Because that was the guy they were working with, the white people there were South Carolina planters who were like, yeah, some of these people obviously are superior to us, and they're going to end slavery on their own. These people of African descent are running the whole show. So old Colonel so-and-so realizes that the shit's going to hit the fan, so he takes those who have risen to the level of being poised to take over, sends people to Liberia. Yeah, that's the purpose of this emigration. Now later, Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany, and even Rushworm and Cornish will start to work with the idea of emigration in contexts where no white people are involved. Because when you bring white people into the equation, they're going to start, the paternalism and the really ingrained, their ability to be anti-racist in this context is obviously very compromised.
Very limited.
Yeah. And, Garrison was an abolitionist. He wasn't an anti-racist. He was kind of a whack job in some ways, too. So, Anaya, yeah, it is crazy, Kiana. All of it's crazy. So we're getting close to the end of our time here. We've talked a little bit about starting the discussion in the assignments. So this is just where you can look at the readings. The question and the prompt for the discussion is the rhetorical purpose and making some annotations and using this rubric to summarize your article and explain what's happening in your article. So Anaya, you have that, I gave you that particularly tricky one because they're reprinting it. And by saying right at the top there, reprinted from, they're kind of like, can you believe this shit? It's not like they wrote it themselves. They're like, and here's what William Lloyd Garrison wants to do in his magazine. You see why we have to speak for ourselves? This is craziness. But they don't state any of it explicitly. However, I find it hard to believe that, the black community, the black readers of this journal weren't like, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. And you get to see a lot more from Frederick Douglass later on of the kind of humor and sarcasm in the plans for whites. So any questions, Rose and Anaya, about what we're doing next? Oh, Anaya, you have the one that we are looking at right here from The Genius of Universal Emancipation, which is copied directly from the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper. And Barak and I are kind of theorizing that the reason they just copied is because Rushworm and Cornish don't want to have any part in it. It's like they cut and paste it. They're like, and here's what they said, and they don't touch it because it's a somewhat interesting plan for removing Africans from the white space of the United States. Gotcha. Okay, great. So Rose and Barak and Anaya, when you get started with your articles, obviously that's going to make a really excellent template, an example for your other classmates to look at. And feel free to look at anything that you want from Freedom's Journal. Next week, we are going to talk about Pauline Hopkins, Phyllis Wheatley, and I'm adding another person, Frances Harper, and about their anti-racism from 1770 to about 1905, because we didn't really get to talk about Wheatley and Hopkins, and Harper just kind of fits in really well with that conversation. And we will go back to the delayed Harlem Renaissance discussion when we're working with Morrison and Malcolm X, because we've rushed way too fast through the very beginning of this. So thanks, Anaya and Rose, and I will look forward to your discussion posts. and I'll send some updates soon. Have a great day.